Good afternoon and welcome to the POLAREAN Imaging PLC investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time by the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Just simply type in your questions and press send. Due to the significant attendance on today's call, the company will not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company will review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it is appropriate to do so. Before we begin, I'd like to submit the following poll. And I'd now like to hand you over to Richard Hallahan, CEO. Good afternoon, sir.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our review. It's good to see you again, many since the IPO, and so I recognize many of those names. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us. We did receive over 100 questions, and so it wouldn't be possible to go through those in series, despite the fact that many of them express requests for information that are certainly appropriate. I think what we did do was take the questions that we had, put them into broad categories, and then push the answers and questions back into the presentation. So hopefully at the conclusion of the presentation, you would have seen your topic and question kind of pre-expressed and answered in the context of the audio for the presentation and the visual aids here. So at the end, then we'll do a bit of a roundup on questions. And then by the end of all that, I think we'll have made a good effort at encompassing all of those things, except for the just most recently arrived ones. I did want to take just a brief moment before we get started here to acknowledge a couple of things. Many of you I speak to live or via email, and you have expressed your frustration with the communications scheme that's been underway for the past months. I did want to share a few things with you, and that is, I think when we all began, you know what our predisposition and culture was like, because we actually hosted live investor symposiums. Many of you met our founders and early KOLs face to face. And so there's nothing that we like better than communicating with you. And I think it's also no secret, and certainly everyone at POLAREAN understands that there were several alternatives on the front end of this with respect to how to get the company started. One of those things would have been trying to publicly list in the US. One of them would have been trying to perhaps get a strategic investor to come in quite early into this with large-scale financing. And I can promise you that if either one of those alternatives had been possible, they might have been executed. But I think this was so difficult to see as a topic early on in its existence that it was not viewed as fundable. It had regulatory hurdles. It had commercial and clinical demonstrations that were too difficult to grasp for anybody to come in. Happily for us, the AIM market existed. And I think all of you know, and certainly everyone at POLAREAN does, that both the IPO and first several rounds of financing were conducted with retail investors in London. And but for that activity, this meeting wouldn't be happening today. And so I wanted to both acknowledge your frustration on the communication side and offer a little bit of an explanation here that in difference from our early days where we enthusiastically ran around telling everyone everything, the more material this all became and the more mature the business became, we've attracted all manner of people with regulations and opinions about what we can say to whom when. And those come not only in the form of financial markets themselves, but also, of course, from regulators. And so we have accumulated, as we've gone along here, some very expert advisors on the subjects, and we follow their advice quite carefully. And so part of the reason for our inability to communicate was certainly not the desire. And I think the last thing that anybody wants is to reach the point of approval and then wind up getting some stern letter from a regulator saying you can't say the things you just said to people out there. So we are learning our way forward a bit with respect to these new guardrails on our communications, but I promise that we will do better in the future on that subject. So without further ado, let's get started. So we are here to discuss Polarian, the fact that we are now approved by the FDA. We're cleared to market. We'll talk about exactly how that works going forward. And we are here to bring advanced three-dimensional, high-resolution functional imaging to pulmonary medicine. Most of you have heard parts of this speech before, in that pulmonary medicine, because of the unique attributes of the lung and because of the physics of the medical imaging technologies that people use for virtually all of the rest of modern medicine, pulmonary medicine was essentially left behind. Left to use some technologies that were 40 or 50 years old, left to use spirometry, and we'll talk about what the consequences of that has been and how we intend to change all of those things. With me today, Chuck Osborne, our CFO. Chuck has a broad experience in life sciences, including a multi-year tour of duty there in the city with one of them. We're so fortunate to have him because financial management in public companies with requirements for foreign financial reporting are quite complicated. And it was a huge benefit to the company to have Chuck join us. Alex Dusek is our Chief Commercialization Officer. I think you all know that when this began, everybody thought it was a story strictly about magnetic resonance imaging. And yet, when we began our collaborative relationship with the FDA, the first thing that we discovered from them was, well, yes, it's about magnetic resonance imaging, but we'd like to point out that inhaled noble gas that you have there, that's a drug. And so that instantly changed the complexion of our company from one of a medical device to one of being a drug device combination. We were really fortunate in attracting Alex into our rather difficult to explain undertakings here. But no sooner did he get here than his background at places like Bayer and United Therapeutics became instantly applicable to everything that we now face doing with respect to commercializing our technology. This scorecard should look familiar. You've seen it in other presentations. Just a quick update on the categories here. So we are now approved. This is, we would claim, a highly innovative product. It's certainly highly innovative if you're the first and only one ever approved. And it is using the inert noble gas xenon 129 to allow the assessment of lung function via visualization, right? So we'll talk about the approval, the content of the approval in just a minute, but happily this gives us access to the biggest vertical markets in pulmonary disease: asthma, COPD, cystic fibrosis, and several others. We do have, and have since the outset of all of this, a strategy that says the place to commercialize this is the high end of academic medicine. And so we are there. We are continuing to push there. And this will be the place where the application of this to clinical problems is developed by the best and brightest in the world. We do have an enthusiastic clinician base. I have to tell you, we just had our commercial launch meeting. It was such a pleasure to have them presenting to us their cases of the week, internally produced videos that they're using inside their institutions to promote the technology. You could hardly keep from jumping out of your chair to watch them tell this story. And of course, in the early days of this technology, as it was for both CT and MR, this is all about department chairs talking to department chairs, the high end of academic medicine collaborating on things. This is how these kinds of technologies do get adopted and commercialized. Importantly for us moving forward, and that is, this is not a one chapter book. This is the beginning of a series of movies and their sequels having to do with succeeding developments opening the rest of pulmonary medicine to inspection, and also leading us into other clinical indications, including cardiology, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, we've always known that aside from the doctors, patients, and hospitals side of all this was the business to business possibility of collaborating with drug and pharma developers. Those would be both kind of respiratory drug therapeutics and also medical imaging contrast agents, and finding ways to help them do their jobs better. And so we see those opportunities, and those are happening. And then in parallel with that, the MR system manufacturers themselves, because this single clinical application does stand to be probably the biggest additional demand for the use and utilization of those assets inside of hospitals. And then finally, as I just briefly described on the slide previously, an experienced management team. These activities are the only things that we have done. They're directly applicable, and I think no one better in a position to take this forward now to its next developments. About the approval. So we do have a drug device combination, reminding us of the kind of special nature of that. It's pretty unique. You don't see a lot of those, particularly in medical imaging. So our approval was of our new drug application, or NDA, and it came through on December 23rd, a few days early compared to its deadline. What is the approved set of things, right? So if you remember, our drug is a gas. It goes to the institution in a gas cylinder. That happens to be an aluminum gas cylinder because we live in the MRI system environment where that's important. The next device that you see in the picture there is our polarizer. That's where we optically excite the xenon to create this 1 × 10⁵ 100,000-fold increase in the signal intensity of the xenon. And then to the right, because the FDA views that we are creating or manipulating a drug at the point of use, we have a QA, or polarimetry station, where we certify that. And then importantly, on the right there is our single-use dose delivery bag for getting the drug from the polarizer to the patient. Just a brief mention there of the wisdom of the selection of that topology, right? There would have been other ways to do this. I think it turns out that the pandemic has proved the point that having a single-use tool for delivery is important in the realm of communicable disease, because there are other technologies in the institution where the patient is hard plumbed to the equipment, and the decontamination of those infrastructures in between patients is virtually impossible. Many of them were actually mothballed during the pandemic. And then also remembering that the polarimetry station does provide a small environment for us where we can decouple the workflows of manipulating the drug from those of handling the patient into and out of the bore of the MR machine. I think really important piece of advice that we received very early on here is you don't want to have orchestrated, timed, simultaneous events needing to take place in either the radiology department or healthcare at large. And so this does provide us the ability to decouple those activities, which we think is really important. We're now down to about 12 minutes to make a dose from up to an hour previously. So these things are all now fitting into kind of a day in the life of a radiology department and an MR machine quite nicely. With respect to the drug itself, then, the key principle here is drugs have labels. The FDA specifies the explicit words used on the label for your drug. And so those are the words for our label. Happily, in our case, a broad label for the use in the assessment of lung ventilation, not only in adults, but also in pediatric patients down to age 12. So in the U.S., the regulatory framework is such that the FDA did not want to see drugs being submitted that had no way to be approved for children. In other words, adult-only drugs. And so it is a requirement to submit with every drug application a plan for pediatrics. We were unable to see a way to use our previous clinical trial for kids because of its unique structure. And so what we had submitted with our submission was actually a request for a brief delay in having to file for our pediatric plan. And so we were expecting in our NDA approval to receive an approval of our request to delay the submission of our pediatric plan. Instead, what we got was approval for kids down to 12, which was an utter surprise. We had never had that conversation with the FDA. We didn't ask for kids down to 12. And I think everybody does know, and of course, it was no secret that we had an SBIR grant with Cincinnati Children's Hospital to develop the use of hyperpolarized noble gas imaging in cystic fibrosis itself, which, by definition is a pediatric disease. But we did not know that they had gone off, self-educated, and concluded based on the data in the public domain and our clinical trial that they were happy to see us do this. So we were surprised pleasantly, not only for the approval on behalf of our collaborators and users, because we do have, as you know, a big cluster of pediatric users built around Cincinnati, Toronto Sick Kids, and BC Children's in Vancouver, but also because we took the endorsement as an indication of kind of where the committee stands with respect to our approval and us. And so very, very happy about that in several different ways. Also, the agency was holding, we had filed these submissions earlier, holding for synchronizing the approval of two devices, right? Additional parts of our drug device kind of combination set here. One is the coil, the chest coil. You know that MR systems don't have detectors in the classic sense. And so the signal collection scheme in MR is an antenna or an RF coil. And so we did get approval for that coil. If you squint just a little bit at the picture, you could see this turning into a product portfolio of coils spanning sizes and sexes and applications, men's, women's, small, medium, large, kids. And so this is a wonderful way when you start stacking up the rows and columns of a quote or invoice for our offered technology, another line in the revenue model for us. And then on the right-hand side, another first of kinds of articles, and that's our first software package. So this is the software which creates the color-encoded, easy to read and interpret images associated with the acquired xenon signal from the MR machine. So very happy to have both of these simultaneously at launch, kind of filling out our ability to commercialize simultaneously all of these products. Just a quick word on our technology and a kind of quick retrospective here, just keeping us all organized with respect to things that are coming. So in our convention, the green of our color encoded scheme, green and blue are good, and red and yellow are not good. And so the way this typically gets presented left to right is a normal, healthy volunteer. These, of course, are single slices out of what are naturally or natively three-dimensional volume acquisitions of the lung, which are the way that radiologists append a key image to a transcribed written report. You adhere the image which best tells the story to the transcribed text. And so these would be the key images of these sets. And then from left to right, from the healthy to the kind of characteristic way that a COPD patient or an asthma patient would be visualized using our technology, quantitatively demonstrating the extent of the ventilation deficit or defect in their lungs. And so these things then become the characteristic indications of states of disease, and we think in the long term progression of disease as well. I think when people talk about AI in the broader sense, no spoiler alert here, AI is coming sooner or later to everything. But I think AI, it's one thing to be applying AI to an image that doesn't natively contain the answer to the question that you seek, hoping to augment the viewer's capabilities by surrounding it with other information versus applying AI to something helping you characterize the characteristics of disease over time. I think we can see that on our way forward here. A little bit about our context, right? So from a business case point of view, let me say, okay, we see the case, we see the benefit, we see the opportunity. What is the scale of what's going on here, right? So on the planet, globally speaking, 500 million people with various forms of pulmonary dysfunction. In our instance, our first instance of a served market in the US, then some 37 million people there with chronic lung disease. Just in the last couple of years, of course, the pandemic has manufactured a vertical segment as big as the biggest segment, which is asthma. On the planet, 100 million. This is a near and dear to our heart topic based on the work being done by Fergus Gleeson at Oxford University there in long COVID and the discoveries that he's making every day in that program. In the US, then the consequence of the difficulty of treating these patients, the US economy is spending $125 billion a year trying to accommodate this because of the tool set that it doesn't have for trying to take care of them effectively. Even so, with the tools that people do have, doing over 5 million procedures a year trying to do this. And so we view those things as subsets of available markets or servable markets today. Then on the right-hand side, trying to add kind of layers of characterization to this market. So we are an adjunct technology to MR. MR is itself approximately $5 billion market, providing these imaging systems to medicine across the globe and in market segments from top to bottom. Happily, the good news for us here is we get to benefit from the combined R&D spend of these manufacturers in advancing the underlying technology set of MR. Part of the reason that we're here is that those guys took the data acquisition times of MR from 20 minutes to 10 seconds. And I'm happy to say, although our label and our submission says it's 10 to 15, we're repetitively acquiring this data in 8 seconds today on a site, which is just about the fastest thing that you can do with an MR machine in a radiology department. And then down and to the right, an overlay that has to do with the urgency of all of this. Okay, the technology works. Okay, the market is there. Who cares? And the answer is a lot of people care, because the consequence of not getting this done is leading into all kinds of desperate outcomes for the patients and families of these patients. So the only kind of therapeutic outcome for cystic fibrosis, interstitial lung disease, and several of these things is lung transplant. And the list for those versus the people who get them is quite small. In the US, if you want to watch inefficiency in healthcare, try to drive a national healthcare system through its emergency room, right? A quarter of the people walking into these ERs come in with shortness of breath and asthma episodes, which are simply examples of medical cases not being managed, right? And then finally, COPD, also the case of these longitudinal diseases trying to be managed by pulmonologists with their existing tool sets, the objective being to keep people at the highest level of function for as long as possible. And without the quantitative reproducible tools to do it, a very, very difficult and if not desperate task. I think this is a chart we've had for quite a while and always a good one. Okay, you have a technology. Okay, it works. Who do you have to unseat when you get to medicine in order to get a seat at the table? And of course, we've gotten this far in the presentation without me having used the words disruptive technology or paradigm shifting technology, because our desire in all of these presentations is that a clinician at the table says it before we do. If you have to say you're a disruptive technology, I think you have a problem. What we want to do is deploy our technology and have a user say, I need to change the way I'm doing this because this is so good. This is so superior. And then just the entry scorecard for us compared to other technologies is we check all the boxes and they do not. And most importantly, since all of these patients are not going to be cured, right? No one's going to be cured of pulmonary disease. This is about having a technology that is recurrently, non-invasively, non-damagingly usable, right? So no radiation, and you can do this back to back, even moments apart, and receive wonderful information and useful information. We're not here to make spirometry disappear. It's ubiquitous, it's low cost, it gives a quick look at expired volume, and it will be a long time before people aren't using spirometry. But it does not provide regional functional information about what's going on inside of someone's lungs. And with that, I'll turn commercialization over to Alex. Alex, please go ahead.
Thank you, Richard. On behalf of the POLAREAN commercial team, I'm very pleased to present where we are. We've been chomping at the bit to get this over the goal line and get out there and start selling. So let me review with you our overall strategy and how we're going to do that. So we have a 4-tier strategy for this year. So as we think about what do we have to accomplish this year to really get a good foothold for this system and for the platform over time. And the first thing is, as Richard mentioned, we have a very enthusiastic current user base. They've been using it in the research setting. And we have about 9 of these sites across the US. And our goal with them is to move them from the current research configuration of our system to a newly approved commercial system. And that takes a fairly small amount of time, a simple service call to be able to upgrade them to the current specs that have been approved by the FDA, and ensure that their entire workflow from attaining the gas to using the system to having it integrated into the PAC system at their sites is following a clinical flow, which is slightly different than the research flow. So some of these sites may have a research system placed near a research magnet, for instance. And we have to ensure that the clinical system and the clinical magnet are in close proximity and that operation is ready to go. So in order to usurp the often 1-year capital equipment purchase cycle, we believe that these people can be done very quickly on a single day service call once we get all of the documentation in place and the contracts in place. In parallel, we'll be looking at reimbursement. This is a key question. I saw a lot of those questions in the chat, and so I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But the good news is we're using a technology with MRI that already exists, CPT codes. Those are procedure codes And those procedure codes exist for chest MRI. So it's not something like some technologies, they have to apply for a new procedure code in order to get reimbursement. We can get reimbursement for the procedure coming right out of the gate. I'll go into in a subsequent slide exactly how we're planning to get reimbursement for the drug component of our overall offering. As we're securing reimbursement over this year, we hope to then start driving gas sales. So as Richard mentioned, this overall platform is a razor blade model, right? So here's our razor blade. That's the cylinder. That's going to be the repeating revenue. Those cylinders, they can, depending on the dose, they can deliver somewhere between 125 to 150 doses per cylinder. For the ventilation indication, one dose is roughly equivalent to one patient scan. And here are targets in order to drive those sales are pulmonologists, surgeons, and radiologists. And that will be through sort of our ventilation promotion. And once we have those things, and we're not going to be waiting for that, but it's going to make the ROI calculation and the sale to the hospital purchasers. This is more the C-suite or the value analysis committee. That's our key audience when we start talking about new systems. So for people that have never used this before in the research setting, but maybe have heard about it from their peers or heard about it at conferences or seen journal reprints, or hopefully soon will have been visited by one of our capital equipment reps. For those people, we hope to expand the footprint from our current base to a new clinical base. So let me talk about first our existing users, that first prong of that of our approach. Here's one of them. This is Jason Woods. Richard mentioned him. He's a key pioneer in this technology and has been instrumental in bringing this into to adults and children, including the adolescents that Richard mentioned that we have as part of our indication. I was going to try to animate this. I'm not sure if we can click on him alone.
No, Alex, we can't animate this.
Okay.
But you
Okay.
continue. Thank you.
No problem. What we have there is a clip of him saying that this is really a cutting edge technology, and he sees this as there are a lot of advancements in asthma and COPD, in obstructive disease, in cystic fibrosis on the medical side. So these medical advancements are happening, but lung imaging has kind of been left in the dust. There's haven't been a lot of innovations. As Richard mentioned, spirometry, which was invented in 1845 or so, is still the go-to test for measuring lung function in a lot of these obstructive diseases. And people recognize that there are a lot of limitations with spirometry. It's effort dependent. It is something where you don't get a regional picture, and the sensitivity to see mild or early disease is very limited. So that's what Jason would have said in that clip. But as you can see, these are the different waves of institutions that currently have our devices that we're planning to move from the research setting to the clinical setting. Some of these have older devices and it's going to take a little bit more time. Some of these have newer devices and they can't wait to get going with the conversion. And so if you look at the very bottom right of our slide here, our 24-month conversion for these is really to get all 9 up and running into clinical use of our gas. As far as the gating items to get out of the gate right away, many of these depended upon FDA approval. So I did see some questions in the chat that came through saying, you know, are there going to be orders ready to go day one? And you know, what about your promotion day one? Some of these things, so for instance, the final labeling, we have to print the manuals, we have to print all of the actual labeling that goes onto the cylinder. Those things came at the end of December. So we're in the midst of doing that and have almost all of that complete. So it's all put into the right format for actual commercial selling. There's also something new for any company that has to come out of the gate with a brand new product. You know, if this was our 4th product, we wouldn't have to worry about it. But for Polarian, it's our first product. And in that sense, we have to apply for state licenses. Now, Many of you know that we have contract manufacturer organizations, both for the devices and for the gas, but we still have to apply for what's called a virtual manufacturer's license in the state that we are in. So we're right in the midst of that in North Carolina, and have very positive signals that that's going to go through very nicely. But that is a requirement before we can ship our first unit. I mentioned the on-site service team will be able to do that probably within a single day at a site once we're ready to go with the revision to the clinical system from the prior R&D systems. Those R&D systems say things on them like for R&D use only. And so that conversion will be both training on the new labeling that the FDA has given us, as well as just some very minor, almost just faceplate type upgrades for those systems. And then the last one has already begun in some of our early institutions, and that is that the hospitals have to, this is a brand new technology. So, if a doctor says, I'd really like to use this, how do they do that? How do they order it? What do they call it? How do they get that into their electric medical record system? All of that is, how do they get the patient scheduled? How do they coordinate that with the gas being produced in the polarizer lab? So a lot of this administrative hassle is taking place right now, and those institutions are building those, what we call pipelines or workflows to enable this to happen. And so I really put all of these bullet points on the right side just to say, this is why we're not, on January 1st, running out of the gate, ready to go. There's a decent amount of upfront work that has to happen, but we hope to have a lot of this wrapped up in Q1 so we can really get cooking in Q2. Reimbursement. Our drug device combination is not just like a pill that you would put in the bottle, send through the wholesale system, and see at a retail pharmacy like CVS or Walgreens here in the United States. That's the typical drug distribution mechanics. As Richard mentioned, this is a drug device combination, and it was supervised by CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation. And so it's really being treated very much like a drug, but it's a unique drug because it requires the device. So the system that you see on the far left, it requires that system in order to activate the drug, to produce the drug. So actually what we're selling when we talk about our gas blend cylinder is the precursor to the active drug, which you see in that dose delivery bag on the right. Let me just move up one level. What I meant to do is orient you to the thirds of this slide. So when we think about reimbursement, there are really three areas of reimbursement that are important. The first is the drug. And so that happens in the hyperpolarization lab. It starts with the cylinder. There's dose production that happens, and then the bag is filled and prepared for the patient. So we have to think about how are we going to get reimbursed, how the hospitals are going to get reimbursed for that drug. And their reimbursement scheme has to include both the gas blend that we sell them, as you can see there, average around $50,000 per cylinder, plus the dose delivery bag that we sell them in a carton of 50, empty bags, and then the labor and overhead it takes for them to produce that dose. And so that's not insubstantial. They should be charging for that as well. So we hope that the hospital will be able to get reimbursement for not just the drug and the empty bag, but also for the labor required at the hospital. And we think that that can be a strong value proposition for them. If you look down to the bottom of that first third, what we're planning to do here is we're planning to submit in the next month to CMS. This is the folks that administer our public funding here in the U.S. For Medicare, what was called an APC, or an ambulatory payment classification. And this APC application will try to do everything that I just mentioned by acknowledging that this is a somewhat complex drug production at the hospital that's facilitated by Polarian, but not 100% completed by Polarian. So it's not something like we can just slap a price tag on a bottle and sell it into the hospital. The actual final product has to be reimbursed, including the labor at the hospital. And we're going to make the case for that and the case for reimbursement over time. In the middle, the MRI suite. So how do you get reimbursed for the procedure itself? As I mentioned up front, there already is a code. This 71550 code is MRI chest. It's a proton-based MRI. Proton meaning hydrogen, which is the anatomical scan that's normally done. But as Richard mentioned, the reason why MRI has not been useful in pulmonary imaging is you can kind of see there in the middle, it's the lungs just look black. It's a lot of air. If you think about an MRI of the knee, you're imaging the water content. You're looking for the hydrogen content. So all you see is this black hole in the lungs, and it's not very useful. Our value proposition is you inhale hyperpolarized xenon-129, and you can see with great definition exactly what's going on in the lungs through a 3D volume. And so these procedures, the proton scan exists. We were successful last year in getting an ICD-10 PCS code for xenon MRI as well. So there will be reimbursement on the procedure side. If you look at the equipment that's required in the MRI suite, that's the chest coil, and we'll be selling that as well into the hospital. And then on the far right, so now the image is acquired. The patient has been imaged. They've inhaled the xenon. Now the image comes out. The MRI tech that you can see on the top right is looking at the image of the 3D lung. But in order for it to be really effective, the XenoView VDP software that Richard mentioned up front, that's key. That's key because that allows you to co-register the proton image with the xenon image, which means for those not in the radiology world, that's basically overlapping the two images. And the proton image, that sort of black hole that I mentioned, provides the thoracic cavity outline for xenon. And because that sort of serves as the denominator, right? The thoracic cavity is how much gas could go in there in a perfect lung. Then you can calculate the percent that's not being ventilated, and we call that our ventilation distribution percentage. And that can be quantified and followed over time. And that's a key part of this technology is because there's no radiation, you can follow these patients longitudinally and quantify their response to therapy. That could be a medical therapy, or it could be an intervention like a valve or a stent. Okay, so that was reimbursement. How are we going to drive the gas sales? We have pulmonary reps that are going to be doing this. And that's a little bit more of a traditional drug sale where we're going to go to all of the pulmonologists in the region at that hospital, have one-on-one detailing with the prescribing MDs to drive the demand. As Richard mentioned, I've had a lot of experience in drug marketing and global product launches in pulmonary disease. When I speak to these clinicians, many of which I've met in prior lives, this is an easy sale. They see it immediately. They see the value and they want to use it. And so that's the good news. The bad news is there's not broad awareness across the US of this technology. And so we have to do a better job at creating broad awareness. But once you get in front of someone, they get very excited about the potential for this for their patients. In the US, there is this, there's this group called OPDP, and that's the Office of Prescription Drug Product Promotion. And they highly regulate what you can say. And so it has to very much conform to the label. But a lot of these clinicians and pulmonologists know about things like, the potential in gas exchange, the potential for long COVID, the potential for ILD, and they ask us questions. And for those questions, we have what are called medical science liaisons. And they report to a medical affairs function in the company, and they are allowed to speak in response to unsolicited requests. They can speak to opinion leaders, facilitate peer-to-peer discussions, have symposia, and talk all about any of those questions that they have. And they're very much less constrained to the label as compared to the pulmonary reps. So as you can see, our quantitative target over the next 2 years is 75 to 100 cylinders that we hope to sell in the United States. How are we going to expand our footprint? We also have experienced capital equipment representatives. They are going to be acting as area Xenon MRI directors, because it really takes a quarterback with a good experience in capital equipment and knowledge of our technology to be able to do this. One upside of the negative news of not getting approval last year is that these people got extremely well tuned to all of the needs that are needed in the hospital to make it successful. We have been talking to sites about joining potential future sponsored clinical trials. And in the midst of that, they recognize that, geez, they have to prepare a room for this system. They have to ensure that it's close to an MRI that has the capability to image Xenon. And all of the learnings that happened over the past year in these discussions have allowed us to hit the ground running day one now with our capital equipment reps. And we have an internal marketing team as well. And so, as I mentioned, increasing awareness both regionally and nationally at conferences. We hope to be at several of the spring conferences, such as ATS and ISMRM, and we're really excited to have our coming out party on the commercial side to be able to promote this technology this year at some exhibit booths and some satellite meetings as well. For these systems, our 24-month target is going to be 15 to 20 systems over the next 2 years. I'll pass it back to Richard to talk about the future.
Just kind of in terms of where to from here on our product roadmap. So beginning with ventilation, which is the sum of asthma, COPD, cystic fibrosis, and surgical planning, 42 million or so patients in the US. And we tend to think of these things in terms of the recurrent care or imaging of patients times the kind of recognition that we get from a revenue point of view by patient. So you can kind of build your own business development model here. Up into gas exchange, which are the higher value in the healthcare system, but smaller vertical markets. So adding the 12 million patients in interstitial lung disease and long COVID, which are diseases that are about the ability of a gas to transit the alveolar structure and then establish affinity with red blood cells in arterial blood flow. And US 12 million patients or so, even more urgent forms of disease, and also with some very interesting characteristics on the pharma side, because the drugs for these interstitial lung diseases have some fairly significant annual price tags. And so not only are clinicians very keen to figure out if someone is a responder, and you've seen us present the drug therapy response slides before, one of the key things the pharma guys are interested in, if you have a $100,000 or $200,000 a year drug regime, you would sure like to know whether the patient benefited or not from that regime. And then up and to the right, kind of even invented or discovered since we IPO'd, this ability for us to characterize what clinicians call microvascular hemodynamics. That's just the blood flow in the capillaries of the alveolar structure. And of course, part of this ER kind of phenomenon where people arrive with, quote, shortness of breath, which is the easier way to say unexplained dyspnea. The triage flowchart for that spans 3 Excel spreadsheets, 3 clinical disciplines, 3 docs, 5 technicians, and 6 weeks of exploration before you can separate pulmonary from cardiac implications and try to understand exactly what's going on with the patient. And we believe that we stand to be able to offer a single episode of care kind of activity here. So there are a lot of people, including the set of cardiologists. So this bridges us from pulmonary medicine to cardiology. And of course, the other happy thing about that is that the only folks in the hospital with more money than the radiologist are the cardiologist. So very happy about that. It will take us a little while to get there. And then off to the right, this kind of B2B opportunity behind the curtain commercially that has to do with trying to help clinicians and the pharma industry pioneer and discover new drugs. This is our kind of new graphic for explaining what we're doing here, right? Just the takeaway one to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Our initial indication in airspaces is visualizing xenon in the free airspaces of the lung, and then succeeding levels of characterization in the advanced assessment of function in gas exchange. So seeing it bound to the alveolar structure and then seeing it bound to red blood cells. These are all quantifiable, discrete measurements that we can make. And then just a quick word on the B2B side. Alex, would you like to give a pharma industry exec's view of this, and then I may chime in?
Sure. Yeah, I've been on the commercial side of several mid-sized to global national pharmaceutical companies, and this really rings true to me. We're always looking for ways to reduce our trial size, reduce development costs, get to the market quicker, and in that you both save money, or potentially you can get rid of losing products. So let's say you have 2 phase 2 products and you're not sure which one to advance into dose ranging. You need a quick answer. And so part of this game is not only looking at winners, but also getting the losers out and choosing between multiple compounds of similar nature. So this slide can be a little bit complex, but if you think about what drives variability, right? Variability is an important measure in any type of outcome measure when you're designing a trial. So what drives variability in this setting, when we talk about lung diagnostics, is what does it look like from a repeatability perspective? If you lie down on the MRI, you inhale xenon today, what's the likelihood you're going to get the same result tomorrow, or even within hours, right? What is that repeatability? What is the variation? As you can see on the bottom, the repeat scan variation is very tight with our xenon scan. That's partially due to the fact that you're lying in a position, we're using a bag that you inhale and you hold your breath. So there's not a lot of movement, there's not a lot of effort that's required. And again, we use your own thorax as your baseline. So we have a consistent measure that's not, let's say, based on a huge population of healthies that are spread all around the world with different demographics. We're measuring this within the context of your own thoracic cavity, so it's that much more precise. When you think about spirometry, I don't know how many of you have had to do this, but it's kind of hard. Depending on how you feel that day, depending on the extent of your disease, you have to blow into this tube, and it's a global measure that's based on reference equations, and there's just a lot of variability. So if you were to do this test, we're using FEV1, the amount of blood exhaled in 1 second. Amount of air exhaled in 1 second. The FEV1 measure is one of the most common measures in obstructive lung disease. That patient, if you did it even separated by an hour, the variation is known to be around 7%. So if those are sort of features of these two technologies, what's the benefit? Well, what we've done is we've looked at that in the context of how do you power clinical trials? And so we kept all of the variables, the alpha, the 0.05, the mu or the mean difference at 2% on the bottom right table, the power to detect the difference at 90%, and the sigma. The sigma often drives the actual numbers that are needed to get a definitive result. And the sigma is the standard deviation, which is it's basically the square root of the variance, right? So a very variable standard deviation is a higher number. And so for spirometry, if the standard deviation is 7 and our standard deviation is 1.5 for xenon MRI, it's remarkable the difference of patients needed to get a result. And so you can see here on the right, 24 versus 542 patients, which is why a lot of these trials for products in asthma or COPD have to wait a long time, enroll a whole bunch of patients to get that lung function measure because of the variability of the test. I will say that this is probably has the greatest utility in early drug development or potentially late drug development. It's not validated as a surrogate marker for lung function yet with the FDA. That'll be a few years away, so it probably won't be a phase 3 measure yet, although we're going to be working on that. But where it can have its utility is in that rule out case in the phase 1, phase 2 pilot studies. And also, I've talked to many of these companies, and several of these companies are interested in using this to differentiate themselves. Some of these inhaled therapies, it's a visualization of the outcome of their drug, the visualization they can use for marketing to show clinicians the effects of the drug. They can also use it for patients. I've talked to some clinicians who show the patients their scans. And some of these drugs, like Richard mentioned, the biologics, for instance, in asthma, or some of the antifibrotic therapies are difficult to stick to. And if you show a patient their lungs are going from red to green and staying green, that's a great motivator for the patients, as opposed to saying, well, your spirometry is 85% of normal compared to 83%. It's just hard to visualize and understand the relevance of that. So this has a lot of utility in pharma clinical trials, and we're absolutely looking to explore that this year.
Great. Thanks, Alex. I would also say that occasionally in business development, when we present this to the pharma business guys, I deliberately put two versions of the slide in. This one, which talks about the statistics, and the same slide again with a different title that says, if your subject cost in a trial is $50,000, then the title of this slide is, would you rather spend $1 million or 27 to get to know on your next compound? I think one would be our suggestion. Just quickly then, we do have our expanding patent portfolio. We continue to file and create new IP. We did get the Hatch-Waxman designation, so we do have the 5-year NCE. Then back to the beginning. So this now hopefully means more in the context of the slides that we have touched and explained. And I think what I'd like to do is move to questions. And I'll turn this over to Chuck to say a few things about about what I would call the category of corporate finance. A bunch of the questions that came in had to do with corporate financial issues. Chuck?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Yeah, the company ended 2022 with approximately $16 million in cash, and executing the plan that we just went through in detail in the presentation. That cash funds the company safely into May of 2024. And the company is exploring all kinds of avenues to get future financing, everything from equity raises to corporate partnering. We believe with the accomplishment of these early commercial goals and some early corporate partnering success, we can time the financing to be at the appropriate time.
Good. I think with that, we're going to run short here. I just wanted to say, it kind of in summary, we have surmounted all manner of phenomenon in market corrections, obstacles with pandemics, regulators suffering the consequences of pandemics, and have achieved each and every one of those. I think there's only one thing for sure, and that is there will be more, and we claim to have the ability to surmount those ourselves. We're on a mission, and that mission is to commercialize this technology ultimately globally. We have drug pricing better than we thought. We have reimbursement better than we thought. We have a label better than we expected, and we're off to be successful doing this, folks. Thanks for your time and attention. I appreciate it today. Have a good day.
Richard, Charles, Alex, thank you for your presentation. And as mentioned, of course, the company will review all questions submitted today and will publish those responses on the Investor Meet Company platform. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as you'll now be automatically redirected to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of Polarian Imaging PLC, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation, and good afternoon to you all.